Welcome to Women's Aid's Price of Safety webinar. Today, we're going to be hearing about our newly published research, The Price of Safety, which looks at what it costs survivors of domestic abuse to flee and to rebuild their lives. This research found that even in the best case scenario, state support does not meet the full extent of these costs. It leaves some survivors, therefore, with a large deficit, meaning an impossible choice between poverty or homelessness and returning to the perpetrator. This research builds on previous Women's Aid research into the links between domestic abuse and economic resources and housing costs, which you can find along with Price of Safety in the research section of our website, womensaid.org.uk. In the webinar today, we're going to hear from Harriet Drew. Harriet is a Senior Policy Officer at Women's Aid. She has recently worked with survivors and Women's Aid member services to update our policy calls on social security, employment and housing, and the Price of Safety research that has come out of that process. Harriet's going to share with us some key findings from the research as our first presentation of the day. We're also then going to hear from Women's Aid member services. So first of all, Zainab Al-Sharif, a Senior Independent Domestic Violence Advocate from Al Hassanaya, is going to share her insight on the particular costs and barriers facing marginalised survivors. So Al Hassanaya Moroccan Women's Centre has been supporting Moroccan and Arabic-speaking women since 1985. It's a UN accredited organisation, and the charity supports thousands of women a year in all areas related to domestic abuse and harmful practices, including honour-based abuse. Zainab has been working as Al Hassanaya Moroccan Women's Centre's Senior IDBA since 2014, so she's incredibly experienced, has a wealth of knowledge on supporting Black and minoritized women, migrant women, including women with no recourse to public funds, and the challenges they face and the best practice for us. So looking forward to hearing from Zainab. We're then going to hear from Emma Gordon. Emma is the Business Development Lead at My Sister's Place, and she is going to share with us her insight on how services can best support survivors under the current system. So Emma's been at My Sister's Place for 4.5 years. She's developed the economic abuse team there. So after 17 years at Citizens Advice as the service manager for money advice, housing and financial education, so she has also a wealth of experience and expertise to share with us today. We'll then hear from Harriet once more on what needs to change so that we can make things better for survivors together. And then finally, the panel are going to take some questions from you. So please submit at any point during the webinar using the Q&A function, and I'll share with the panel at the end. So without further ado, I will hand over to Harriet as our first presenter. Welcome, Harriet.
Thank you, Sarah. It's great to be here. If I get the next slide, please. So I wanted to start by saying a little bit about why we did this research. So as Sarah said, it's clear from the existing evidence and from frontline experience that financial issues and economic abuse are trapping survivors in dangerous situations. And when I was looking into this, I couldn't find any research which quantified the costs of leaving an abuser, the size of those financial challenges, which I thought was important to do because numbers help convey the scale and the seriousness of the challenges which survivors are facing. They also show where the gaps are in terms of support and also show which policy changes could have the most impact in reducing the deficit that survivors face. So with that in mind, we set out to answer two questions. The first was, over a year, how much could it financially cost a survivor to leave a perpetrator? And we chose the period of a year because survivors and our member services told us that leaving is a process, it's not a single event. And at any point in that process, an unaffordable cost could force a survivor to return to a perpetrator. And we also asked, to what extent are these costs currently covered by benefits, legal aid, and other forms of financial support? Because we know that due to economic abuse, many survivors have no savings or regular income to fall back on. The next slide, please. So in terms of how we did this, our numbers are based on what we call an illustrative case study. So the data on domestic abuse isn't good enough to allow us to calculate an average for this figure. So what we did was we looked at research on survivors' journeys as they left. We constructed a kind of fictional typical journey and then costed that. And in doing the costs, we only included what we call direct costs, so costs which were triggered by leaving, which wouldn't have been incurred otherwise. And we haven't included costs that survivors would have faced previously whilst with the perpetrator, for example, groceries and bills, which gives us a conservative estimate. And then we've also assumed that our fictional survivor, who we're calling Anna, has full entitlement to state support. We wanted to show what would happen in the best case scenario, as I'll talk about later. There are obviously other cases. The next slide, please. So in terms of our findings, our headline finding was that Anna, our fictional survivor, would face a deficit of about £10,000 over the course of a year after leaving. And that's based on our estimates of costs and available support in 6 different areas. The first is what we call immediate costs, the ones that are triggered in the first week or so after leaving. The second are housing costs, because this is likely an additional cost on top of survivors paying rent or a mortgage on the property they fled from. We know that perpetrators often make it very difficult for them to get out of those costs. We included legal costs based on family court proceedings for child contact, because we know that perpetrators often initiate these as a form of post-separation abuse. We included health costs, which is 1 year's worth of counselling to deal with the impacts of the trauma and mental health caused by the abuse. We included travel costs based on the fact that setting up a new life involves frequent appointments with multiple agencies, which wouldn't have been needed before. And childcare costs. We've costed a part-time nursery place because as a single parent in a new area facing multiple appointments, childcare would be much more difficult. And we haven't shown it here, but we've also factored in some child support payments to the survivor from the perpetrator. So even in this best case scenario, there's a deficit across every category. You can see the full report for the figures and the breakdown. And it would be much worse for survivors who don't have access to public funds because of their immigration status. The deficit would be twice as high at £20,000. So I haven't got time to break down all the categories now, but I'll go through a couple to give you an idea of how we did these costings. Okay, next slide, please. So the first category is immediate costs. So we've included the travel to flee, which is £100 for a train ticket and a taxi at the other end. We know that most survivors cross local authority boundaries in order to be safe and out of reach of the perpetrator, and therefore can face quite a long journey. We've also included the costs of replacing essential possessions, knowing that the point of leaving or separation is a dangerous time for the survivor, and we've assumed she would have to leave quickly, pack lightly and secretly to stay safe. We've also included the costs of new ID for several different types for the adult survivor and the child survivor, because we know that perpetrators often withhold this to keep survivors trapped, but the ID is essential for many aspects of setting up a new life, like applying for benefits or enrolling a child in nursery. We've included the costs of a new phone and laptop because perpetrators often install trackers or spyware on devices. And if Anna were to take these with her, she'd be in danger of being located. So we've included the costs for basic models, £250 altogether, because we know that technology would be needed to manage universal credit and other applications and essential admin. So this totals £970. And in terms of the support available, the Flexible Fund, which is provided by the Home Office and distributed by Women's Aid, offers grants of up to £500 for immediate costs. And critically, applications are confirmed within 2 working days, so it can be available when it's needed. But it still leaves Anna with a deficit of almost £500. And beyond the deficit is a complicated loop of requirements in that survivors can't submit an application for universal credit without bank account details, but they need ID to set up a bank account, and they might not be able to afford the ID before their benefits come through. So they end up stuck in a kind of chicken and egg situation. And this shows that it's not just about having support at the right level, but also about whether it's accessible and available at the right time. Next slide, please. So here are the housing costs. We've estimated that Anna would spend some time in temporary accommodation and then in the private rented sector. And this is despite the fact that refuge and social housing would be preferable in terms of the recovery support they offer and the security. But these are often not available due to lack of funding and availability. I'll flag just a few costs here. The first is for temporary accommodation. When survivors stay here, councils receive a subsidy for that, but it's based on the local housing allowance rates for 2011. So it doesn't cover the full cost of that accommodation. And some councils will top this up, but not all. And research by Shelter has found that many people find the cost of temporary accommodation hard to meet. So Anna could face a shortfall of almost 2.5K herself. And then also I want to point out the discrepancy for survivors with no recourse to public funds. This is the area with the largest discrepancy of all the categories. They wouldn't be eligible for housing benefit or universal credit. And even drawing on schemes like the Future Fund or the Supporting Migrant Victims Fund, they would still face thousands of pounds of housing costs over the year and potentially no way to pay them. So in terms of the worst case scenario, the next slide, please, because we focused on the best case so far. Not all of this support is guaranteed that we've included. For example, the flexible fund is not guaranteed past 2025. Discretionary housing payments rely on local council criteria and availability. Legal aid relies on proof of domestic abuse in the family courts, which can be hard to come by. And child maintenance may not be paid. It's often withheld by the perpetrator as a form of abuse. So if we take away this support, which is in question, the deficit increases over 3.5 times to £36,000. And this is even for survivors who have access to public funds. Next slide, please. There are also many other reasons why survivors may face a large deficit. They could face higher costs. For example, if they flee to areas with high housing prices, for example, London and the South East, their costs will be higher. If they have more children to provide for, or if they're facing complicated or lengthy proceedings in the family court, which can cause the costs of legal representation to soar. There may also be survivors who need a car or taxis to get around. They might live in a rural area, or they might have disabilities, and that can be a major expense. And survivors may also have access to lower support. So we've already mentioned the implications of a no recourse to public funds condition, but they might also be subject to the benefit cap or the 2-child limit. And these are policies that break the link between need and entitlement in the benefit payments. And they could also just struggle to apply for support because the benefit system is so complicated. And this could be particularly the case if they don't speak much English, if they have learning disabilities, or if they have a complicated immigration status like pre-settled status. And in terms of what this deficit actually means, it could prevent survivors from leaving in the first place, but it could also threaten their ability to what we call stay fled if they do leave. They could be forced to return to the perpetrator to feed their children. And I'll talk more about the policy changes we want to see later, but I'll pass on for now to Zainab, who will talk about the particular challenges faced by marginalised survivors.
Thank you, Harriet. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Harriet, and thank you to the Women's Aid team for this really important piece of research. And for the key findings. My name is Zainab, and as mentioned in the introduction, I work as a senior IDBA with Al Hassaniya Moroccan Women's Centre. My focus is going to be on the experiences of Black and minoritized women and our client group's experience in relation to the financial costs when trying to flee and fleeing domestic abuse. One of the main challenges and factors that we see is with women with no recourse to public funds. Sorry, I forgot to say, next slide, please. Thank you. So one of the main issues is around no recourse to public funds. We support a large number of migrant women, and no recourse is one of our major challenges, as it is for a number of other buy and for services. We know that the visa or the victim survivor's status in the UK is weaponized by the perpetrator. Fear is instilled in victim survivors through a number of different tactics that the perpetrator uses, including threats around deportation, threats that the victim survivor will not be able to survive in the UK without the perpetrator, threats about the local community. So the riots, the race riots that we saw in the summer has also been an additional factor that some perpetrators have been using to scare and intimidate victim survivors in remaining in the relationship, telling them that, you know, if they were to try to flee, they would be victims of Islamophobic attacks or racist attacks. But in addition to those fears and those worries, there are additional concerns that many victim survivors have, such as isolation. We know perpetrators use this as a typical tactic to try and control victim survivors more and prevent them from having resources or people, friends, or acquaintances that they could seek support from. We also know that another tactic that some perpetrators may use is around family. So misinforming family that if a victim survivor was to try and flee, that she wouldn't be able to survive, that the children would get taken off her, that she would be deported or her visa would get cancelled. Again, family members may not have full awareness of how the UK system works and may then try to convince the victim survivor to remain. Additional concerns could be around children. Victim survivor may be pregnant or have children, young children, or teenage children who don't want to flee with her, don't want to leave the family home, don't want to leave their school, don't want to be uprooted. Those concerns are real concerns to a lot of our victim survivors. We know the finance as well is a major issue. Perpetrators causing debt in the victim survivor's name, joint bank accounts, taking benefit money, not allowing the victim survivor any access to it. And even if a victim survivor has been living in the UK for a number of years, we know that domestic abuse and especially financial abuse and dependency on the perpetrator can affect women who've been in the UK for 10 years or 20 years. The main factor is, of course, power and control. I think what we see from a lot of the victim survivors that we support is a lot of uncertainty and a lot of concerns about fleeing. If we're able to offer them the right support, tapping into grants such as the one that Harriet mentioned, that Women's Aid managed to secure from the Home Office, lifesaver. It's a lifesaver. But again, as mentioned, it's not guaranteed. It's not something that we're seeing happening every year, unfortunately. So as a service, our concerns are around the victim survivors' worries, which are very real, in addition to the traumas that victim survivors experience, but also other challenges for when victim survivors do flee, how they can maintain safety and a secure and consistent income is another separate challenge. And unfortunately, we see that the system is not supporting victims of domestic abuse to remain safe in suitable accommodations or to have secure financial consistent income, which in some instances results in victim survivors returning to the perpetrators. And as we're aware from many studies, this increases the risk towards victim survivors and children. So in addition to the no recourse to public funds, as we mentioned, we know there are other challenges for women, for example, on pre-settled status, with the inconsistencies that we're seeing from the DWP as well as from housing. We are also seeing issues with the DWP, universal credit applications to actually make an application. Occasionally, the perpetrator uses the victim survivor's phone number or email address, which then causes an issue when she tries to make her own separate application. And although it does get resolved, it takes time. And I think time is a key factor, because if a victim survivor doesn't feel that she is financially supported from day one, it will only cause issues. And as we mentioned, it can result in her returning to the perpetrator because she feels she has no other options. We know again with the DWP, there are issues with women who may not be able to use technology to log in women who don't speak the language are unable to use their portal, women who are illiterate, they don't know how to read and write in English or in their mother tongue language. That results in sanctions, that results in benefits being suspended, which then has a knock-on effect on housing benefit and debt and anxiety and stress and threats of being evicted. We know we have issues with legal aid trying to secure legal aid to explore occupation orders or protective orders, again, depending on the victim survivor's income. All of those things are additional barriers. We know there's an increase right now in technology facilitated abuse. Women, Harriet did mention it as well in the introduction, but we know that some women fear having trackers on their cars, need to take it to be checked on, need to take their phones to be checked on. All of that is additional costs for a woman trying to flee. Next slide, please. I'm very conscious of time. So I titled this slide, The Changes That We Deserve to See. So not that we need to see, we deserve to see these changes. Victim survivors deserve to have these changes in place. Top one is to abolish no recourse to public funds, but that's something we've been calling on for many, many years. Haven't seen it happen. So if we can't abolish no recourse to public funds, at least make the MV-DAC accessible to all. Making sure that funding is accessible to services such as ours, buy and for services, so we can easily tap into these funds to support women who are ready to flee there and then. Making an application can take some time. Women's Aid is, they have an amazing process, very fast, but there are times where a woman needs to flee today. Next slide, please. Remodeling the child maintenance service. It's another way that perpetrators take advantage of victim survivors. Free and faster immigration advice or legal advice for victim survivors. Mentioned before, the DWP needs to be looked into. Making sure that there are better provisions for victim survivors when it comes to safe accommodation, suitable accommodation, the costs surrounding that. And when a victim survivor is trying to rebuild her life, trying to be more independent, to try to look at studying or working, better childcare provisions, something more affordable for victim survivors as they're trying to transition from living in an abusive household with a perpetrator who is in full control of their finances into an abusive-free household where she is in control and trying to live and bring up her children in a safer environment. Again, I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to round up, but I think what I'm trying to, the message I'm trying to really portray is that we have the challenges that victim survivors face in relation to the domestic abuse and the fear and the control that the abuser tries to inflict on the victim survivor. But in addition to that, we have the policies and the system that needs to change. And whilst we're all coming together to try and make sure that these policies do change, sadly, we've got a lot of work to do. And we can only make changes by making sure that our client groups' experiences are being shared in platforms such as this one, and with policy changes and policymakers. And that is what we're trying to do. So I hope that, with this report, it does shed some focus on the financial aspect, and that some changes can start to have an impact on the victim survivors trying to flee. I'll finish there. Our apologies, I've gone over my time. Thank you. Next slide. Well, the previous one was just about Maslow's hierarchy of special needs, just talking about how if we're not meeting our needs at the most basic levels, so shelter, food, accommodation, safety, we're never going to reach the higher part of the hierarchy where we're contributing to society, where we have better confidence and self-esteem. And I'll stop there. I'll hand over now to the next panelist, to Emma, who'll talk a bit more. Thank you.
Thank you, Zainab, and thank you again to Women's Aid for inviting me to speak on this important subject. Next slide, please. So I'm from My Sister's Place. We're a specialist domestic abuse charity. We're based in Middlesbrough in the northeast of England. We employ 38 people and have a team of volunteers. We incorporated in 2002 and we've expanded, we've nearly doubled in size in the last 5 years. Next slide, please. We've recently reevaluated our vision, mission, aims and values. So we've got new ways of working, new funding streams, and we've refreshed our branding. So our aim is to encourage, enable and empower, because we believe given the right resources, everyone has the capability to thrive. Our vision is to create safer communities where everyone can live free from domestic abuse. I know that's a bold vision, but it's what we've got. Our mission is to provide high quality, innovative, end-to-end services which enable individuals and families to move from surviving and thriving. Next slide, please. And our values are that My Sisters Place stands for a place of safety, hope and change. So a place of safety for those seeking to escape the domestic abuse, the right level of practical help and emotional support to aid recovery and build hope, and the possibility of a life change towards a better future. Next slide, please. So our services, we have IDVAs, we've got a big team of IDVAs, not as many as we need. We've got IDVA support for young people, support for clients aged 13 to 24. We have an IRIS project, which is early intervention IDVA support, and it's support through GP practices. And we've trained GP practices on identifying domestic abuse and making them referrals. I'm going to talk about our economic abuse service that we've set up. We have trauma-informed therapy and EMDR for adults. We've also got our trauma therapy for children, our community outreach, so our Ask Me project, Freedom Programme, and our Stepping Stones group as a peer support group. We did also have our Route to Perpetrator support, but we're not currently commissioned for that. But it's something that we want further funding to do, because we believe it starts at educating the perpetrators as well. And we also provide training on numerous areas of the service. This next slide, please. So our clients, so the environment that we work in is very challenging. Cleveland has one of the highest crime rates in England and Wales, and is one of the highest sexual violence rates. So weapon-enabled violence, domestic abuse and sexual offences, with high rates of deprivation, with Middlesbrough ranking as one of the most deprived local authority in the UK. Domestic abuse offences account for a quarter of all serious violence in Cleveland, and nearly a third of homicides and attempted homicides, which is 31%. The clients we see can vary from fleeing that day with just a clothes on their back to, or if they want to do a planned move from the perpetrator. We get referrals from the police, along with self-referrals from the local authority and other agencies. We have clients with no recourse to public funds and need immigration advice and require the MDAC, the Migrant Victim of Domestic Abuse Commission form, to be completed before they can access any public funds. Of people living in poverty for years and they've been surviving day to day, some not knowing they're entitled to benefits or other support. Rent arrears is a huge barrier to being rehoused over in Middlesbrough, and more support is definitely needed in this area. People have substantial debts and a threat of enforcement action, not always and usually caused by the perpetrator. Our clients have complex needs, so they could be experiencing drug, alcohol issues, mental health, along with language barriers, working with children's services. So in a nutshell, people's lives are in a mess, and they need our support to help them put them back the pieces, back together, after they've experienced domestic abuse or haven't really experienced it. Next slide, please. So our economic abuse service, we receive referrals from our IDVA service once a full assessment and safety plans being completed. And our economic abuse service provide the practical and emotional support and look at removing the barriers currently being experienced to help people start rebuilding their lives. So in order to do this, we look at benefit checks, we look at maximising their income, making benefit claims and appeals, attending assessments, that could be PIP assessments, going to the job centre with them to do the universal credit claims. We can apply for grants, school places, school meals, and help with volunteering opportunities and training once they're ready for that. There's just so much involved within the team, what they actually do. it'd be too much to list, really. We have immediate access to grants due to being a Smallwood Trust partner, which has been a massive help for some of the women that we work with. And then we've just received a 3-year funding from the lottery to expand our economic abuse team due to the need that we've experienced. Next slide, please. So just some of the outcomes that that our team have achieved in the last year. So just over 89,000 ongoing yearly entitlements of benefits that people were not claiming. So that could be universal credit, disability benefits, child benefit, anything like that. So that we've calculated that on a yearly basis. They've received over £21,500 worth of backdate of benefits. And that'd be sort of lump sum payments, which have a massive effect on being able to plug some of that gap that people are experiencing. We help people get reduction in water rates. So we work with Northumbrian Water in our area. So £4,680 over the year in reduction in water rates we've helped people get. Of nearly £14,000 worth of grants from Buttle, Greggs and the Vickers Relief Fund. So Vickers Relief help with bonds and rent in advance and also removal costs. And this last year we awarded 26,700 Smallwood grants, and we also got approached to have another grant from Open Philanthropy, Tackling Hardship Fund, and we were able to give them grants out to women and also to men in this case, to cover any needs that they need to cover, really. So we'll look at the next slide, please. So I've just got some tips of what people should actually look for and what they should be doing, really. So we use the Turn To Us benefit calculator. It's not too bad to use, but it's better if you've got like someone who does know what they're doing. We've got our dedicated Job Centre Plus service delivery coaches. We work with them on a daily basis, so they're really experienced workers in domestic abuse, and they're tailored support for the clients that we work with. They'll set up face-to-face appointments to do their claims. There's no long waits on the phone, like that hotline to them. Issues are dealt with really quickly, and we can separate claims. So they're there at the drop of the hat. We wouldn't be able to help a lot of these clients if it wasn't for them. It would put them in further deficit and possibly go back to the perpetrators based on that. So in Middlesbrough, we have a flexible fund. I know not to be confused with the Women's Aid Flexible Fund. It's the Middlesbrough Local Authorities fund that they use for people with no recourse public funds. And that's mainly used for refuge costs or hotel accommodation, whilst we are helping people apply for the domestic abuse discretion, so they can then apply for benefits. So we work alongside them, work really close with the local authority to make sure they're not paying over what they need to, so then they will be covered with the benefits. Children's services, they have funds, but they don't shout about it. They try not to let people, not on purpose. I think it's everywhere. Everything's limited, isn't it? All parts of funding. So, but don't be scared to ask, because if you don't ask, you don't get, do you? So we always do that. Build relationships with the local citizens advice. We've got and your banks. We have some good banks in our area that, if we go in, they know how to deal with our survivors. And our local authority really good, and local support. Just partnership working is key, really. So getting to know who's in the same wanting to do, helping with the same clients, really, aren't we? So partnership working, it is key to everything. And we also utilise the Surviving Economic Abuse website tools, which has a big array of like what grants are available, benefits, and the financial help that's available to people. They can also help with when people have accrued debts, through the perpetrator. They can help to try and get some of those debts written off. So it's really good to get in touch with them. Pay plan work alongside Surviving Economic Abuse as well, to use the domestic abuse evidence form, which a lot of people, they have had some really good write-offs. So I suggest using that. Next slide. Next slide, please. I think that's what we provide training. So we are looking to train other women's aid agencies on the economic abuse and what like step-by-step and checklists and things of what we can do. So please contact me if you'd like to do anything with that regarding that. And I'd like to pass over to Harriet, please.
Thank you very much, Emma. I'm just going to end by saying a bit about what we would recommend to change some of the challenges and situations that have been described today. So next slide, please. So I think, as all the panelists have shown, the support available to survivors who have fled is often not very accessible. And even when it is, it might not be sufficient, or it might not be domestic abuse informed. And for the social security system to be a true safety net for survivors, we need to tackle all three of these things. Next slide, please. And here are some of the recommendations we make in our report for how to do this. Many have been touched on as well by the other speakers. So to make it more accessible, we recommend exempting survivors from the no recourse to public funds condition. We also recommend exempting them from the legal aid means test to make it easier for them to get support for the family court. And we recommend building more social homes to meet demand, because this type of secure tenancy is crucial to survivors' ability to rebuild their lives. In terms of sufficiency, our recommendations are for the Department for Work and Pensions. We recommend linking benefit levels to the cost of living, as charities like the Trussell Trust have drawn attention to with their Essentials Guarantee report. We recommend uprating local housing allowance rates every year to make sure they cover local rents and there isn't that dangerous shortfall that survivors can face. And we recommend scrapping the 2-child limit and the benefit cap, which reduce survivors' benefits often disproportionately. I spoke to one refuge in the south of England that said about 98% of their survivors were subject to the benefit cap when they moved out. In terms of making support more domestic abuse informed, we recommend that the Home Office guarantees funding for the Flexible Fund in the long term. This type of support is really valuable because it can be very quick and responsive to survivors' individual needs in a way that the benefit system as a whole is not able to do. We recommend that the Department for Work and Pensions assesses all new social security policies for their impact on survivors' ability to flee, to avoid unintended consequences, which can keep survivors trapped. And we also recommend that across government, specialist domestic abuse services are adequately funded. As Emma has shown, these are vital to supporting survivors to access their full entitlement. And as Zainab has shown, they provide such a help in overcoming the barriers that are often in survivors' way. So in our report, you can see that we've tried to cost some of these recommendations in terms of how much they would reduce the deficit and facing survivors. And what we want to show is that whilst a lot of these recommendations involve investment by the government, domestic abuse currently costs society about 78 billion a year. And most of these costs are a direct result of the harms that perpetrators inflict on survivors' health and employment. And strengthening social security would help survivors leave abusers and would actually save the government money over the long term, as well as saving lives. So I'll pass back to Sarah now for our Q&A. I think you're on mute, Sarah.
Somebody had to do it. Thank you to all our speakers. There were some really informative presentations there today, and really brings home the stark reality of what it's like for survivors after having made that really difficult decision with its own complexities to leave, to actually do that safely and to stay fled. And what that brings, I do have a few questions for the panel. First of all, I just wanted to add a few questions around resources that will be available after the session today. So just to confirm that the reports that Harriet has presented on price of safety is available in the research section of the Women's Aid website. So that's womensaid.org.uk. And we will be putting the recording that we're taking of this webinar in the same place as well. And you can also see all of our other research around the economics of abuse, hidden housing crisis, and related evidence there as well. Okay, so I've got a question. Shall I put this to the whole panel? I'll pick people, and then if anybody else wants to add anything in, please feel free to do so. So I'll put the first one to you, Harriet. What role do you think that child maintenance plays in these costs and the support for them?
So we included child maintenance in our calculations because while it's not a direct form of government support, the government does have quite a big role in ensuring that it is paid, particularly in cases of domestic abuse, because it's often not safe to try and arrange child support privately. And I should say that parents have a legal responsibility to provide for their children, even if they're no longer with them. But a perpetrator often withholds that support to harm the survivor's finances and either punish her for leaving or try to force her to return. So most survivors are going through the child maintenance service, and there's been quite a lot of research and reports about how that's not delivering for survivors, that often the CMS doesn't investigate when survivors report that perpetrators have been fiddling the numbers, and it's quite hard to get them to take enforcement action to recover the payments that they're owed but haven't been paid to them. So we included half of the child maintenance payments in our calculation, but the services we worked with to come up with this kind of journey and this figure said that in their experience, very few survivors they worked with received anything. So in fact, that's actually quite a generous estimate. But to show the impact that it could have if survivors were to receive their full child maintenance payments, it would reduce the deficit in our example by 20%, so significantly. And there are government proposals out for consultation or just closed on reforming the child maintenance service, which, if implemented well, could have a really positive effect on that.
Absolutely, there's definitely something that we can do. Is there, Emma and Zainab, is there anything that you'd like to come in on child maintenance?
Go ahead.
Should I go? I'll go. So yeah, we do see that a lot. Hardly anybody, when we do a financial statement with people, they don't get child maintenance, and a lot don't want to even claim the child maintenance because it's an extra. It's more contact, isn't it? It's with the perpetrator potentially. So, and like you say, yeah. So yeah, it does have a massive effect.
Just following on from what Harriet and Emma said, absolutely, child maintenance is a major issue that we are seeing with our client group. So we see perpetrators trying to play the system. If they're in employment, they quit working, go on benefits. We know that benefits are essentially designed for one person, so not really designed for to support child maintenance. So unfortunately, you know, mums are told you're only going to get something ridiculous like £5 a month or something. For some mums, it's not worth it. It's not worth the hassle. For some, they feel like, no, the perpetrator needs to be held accountable for everything, and they have a responsibility. But yeah, we are seeing issues as well where perpetrators are not paying. Victim survivor needs to chase it up. It causes a lot of stress, a lot of hassle. As Harriet mentioned, issues with enforcement, issues with perpetrators working cash in hand, and child maintenance not having the resources to investigate. So again, it is one of the areas that we feel needs to be looked into and changed in order to support victim survivors more.
Definitely. So it's a really, you know, it's a really important part of the puzzle in making things better and ensuring that survivors can stay fled, isn't it? And it's and having an analysis of coercive control when reforming that is vital, as you've all, perpetrators will use the system. Okay, I'll just move on. I've got a few questions. I'll pose this one initially to you, Zainab, if that's okay, and then feel free to come in afterwards. So how prevalent is it for women to return to perpetrators, and what risks do they face?
It's very common, unfortunately. We do see victim survivors who flee. Some, if they don't like to use the word lucky, but if they have acquaintances or friends, they sofa surf for a while, a few weeks, especially in cases of no recourse to public funds, where if they're eligible for the MVDAC takes around 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks to come through. Unfortunately, we see some women who then go into refuges, feel that they're not able to continue, either because universal credit takes quite long to get into their bank accounts, or they just feel that they're in a new area, unfamiliar with the local facilities, away from any support networks. And this is separating from a perpetrator is one of the most vulnerable phases of a victim survivor's life. So she's extremely vulnerable. She's got 1,000,001 questions going through her mind. Have I done the right thing? If she's got children, my children are crying for their father, or my children are crying for their bedrooms and they want to go back to their cozy beds. So she's got a number of questions, doubts, and this is a time where we see sometimes the perpetrator coming in to try to convince her, apologize, make all the promises in the world. Occasionally family as well, family pressure, especially from certain cultures, talking about how shameful it could be for the victim survivor to flee, to give him another chance. So many different factors play into it. And victim survivors, either because of the situation and the conditions they're in, or because of pressures from family or their children, they feel, let me give him one more chance, and they go back. But as I mentioned before, we do know from a number of studies and researches that the risks increase considerably when a victim survivor goes back. Perpetrators tend to, if there are other services involved, like social services, things may be okay for a while because they know that there's external eyes on them, so to speak. But once services close their cases, we do see incidents happening, and they can be more severe. Maybe not physical, but controlling, financial abuse, sexual abuse. And ultimately, we do see victim survivors being re-referred into services and wanting support to flee again. So that's why I think it's really tying it in with the research that Women's Aid have done. It's really important to make sure that services are well funded. When women flee, everything is in place for them. So that's not an additional reason why they think I need to go back to the perpetrator.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was just going to add into that, just follow on from what Zainab said there. Yeah, if we did have the more funding all services, we would have an economic abuse team where they could immediately access them benefits, get that support in place from day one, so they don't have to even think about going back. They know they've got that support. They can get everything near enough everything that they need, with a lot of hard work from the different teams, and just tapping into all the resources that are available. And if obviously the flexible fund within from the government, if that is extended as well, then yeah, things could change, couldn't they? But it needs to have the extra support there.
I've got a couple more questions, but is there anything, Harriet, you wanted to come in on that one? That's thank you. So I'll pose this one to you, Emma. But again, so we've had a question that starts off with so many women that this provider's support struggle to stay engaged with the service due to mental health needs or isolation by the perpetrator. So the question then is, how can we help make sure that these women don't get lost in the system and we can support them with those practical and financial issues?
So partnership working, isn't it? So it's having their multi-agency meetings and making sure that people, they've got a team around them, so it's not just one agency working with them, so people can access the mental health. There needs to be more funding for mental health as well, doesn't there? Because the waiting list for that. And sometimes people think they don't need that counselling and mental health support because they've got it now, but they've got through, like they've fled, but then they get back into another relationship that's domestic abuse again. So they also need education as well, don't we? So education about, obviously we have the Freedom Programme in our Stepping Stones group and Ask Me awareness sessions. So making a lot of people aware of what's available as well, I think. Yeah.
And awareness of post-separation abuse, that just because the relationship has ended, it doesn't mean that the domestic abuse has.
Yeah, so it's the ongoing, so it's having that hand-holding afterwards as well. So we do look at getting people into volunteering opportunities and training, and just getting them out there again, because what we find from when people have finished our freedom programme and they've left the perpetrator, they've always been told what to do. So then all of a sudden they've got, like, they're on their own, they've got nothing. Like Zainab said, they're isolated. They need to then make friends, they need to go out and do groups and get into employment. So it's having the funding again to make sure them services are in place to be able to carry out the duties that are needed, really, to help these women.
Definitely. I think it speaks to why services like My Sister's Place and Al Hassanaya are so important, because you're set up to provide that holistic support. It's not just in a moment. You know, funded properly, you've got your resettlement move on programs, and you can, you know, support people through to independence, but still having that context of domestic abuse and trauma informed support. Did anybody else want to come in on that one?
Yeah, just to say that when we were producing this report and deciding whether or not to include mental health costs, we felt strongly that they were an essential part of recovery and enabling women to get the most out of their support and rebuilding their lives. Because I've spoken to a few survivors who've listed all the appointments they've had to attend and said it adds up to a full-time job, basically. And at the same time, you're trying to support a child to recover, get used to a new area. And that's a very heavy mental burden to deal with for anyone, let alone someone who's been through years of abuse and trauma. And we felt that the mental health support was an essential part of the recovery and being able to engage with all other aspects, not just a piece on its own.
Definitely. And we have 5 minutes of the webinar left. I wanted to just pose one last question, and I'll sort of put it to anybody who can answer, because I think it's important to sort of be aware of all the different types of experiences of domestic abuse that we have. So what are the complexities, I guess, around financial dependency, where the perpetrators are family members and not just the intimate partner, but other family members? What additional complexity does that bring to our work? Throw it out to anybody.
I think I can start by saying the reason why we calculated the state support costs rather than factoring and as taken for granted support from family and friends is we know that for lots of survivors that's not necessarily an issue. And in our housing, or that's not necessarily a possibility, in our housing report that Sarah mentioned earlier, we found that even when some survivors were able to sofa surf with friends and family, that could either really damage the relationship going forwards, or the family could be influenced by the perpetrator to then put influence on the survivor. So we didn't want to take for granted that family support was accessible, because we know for lots of reasons it's complicated.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yes. In our area, lots of people, it's generational, isn't it? So we're now seeing the children of the women going through the domestic. So yeah, so we've had the women and we've supported them to get through everything, but then their children are now coming into our service, and a lot of it is due to drugs, alcohol misuse, and just education around in our area. It probably isn't limited to our area, but it just seemed really, really high. That family members are also involved in the drugs, in the crime. It's just it's a big circle, and it has a knock-on effect. Some people just haven't got anybody that they would feel safe going to. Probably have got a lot of family, but that safety, it might not be there. And the strain on relationships, if they have got that, because some people, if they went to the parents, they might have their children, so the children might have been taken from them because of domestic abuse, so they couldn't then go to the family member because they're not able to have contact with the child. So there's just complicating factors all across, isn't there?
I know our previous research highlighted the importance of those informal support networks in escaping, and to not have them there has a massive impact. If there's nothing else to add on that question, I will bring us to a close today and thank all of our panelists enormously for your time. The slider that's up at the moment will share some links on how to find out more about us, our social media, or research bulletin. Phoebe, did you want to say?
Hi, sorry, I just wanted to jump in to plug our new research bulletin, which is a bi-monthly research bulletin produced by the Women's Aid Research and Evaluation team. And if you would be interested in signing up, I am posting a link in the chat now, but this is where we share a variety of kind of links to recently published research, kind of up-to-date statistics and findings, and free or low-cost events, and it's all to do with kind of domestic abuse and violence against violence against women and girls research in the sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phoebe. Please do sign up. It's a really informative bulletin. Please do look at our website, find out a bit more about what we do, and in particular, explore our research pages. So finally, thank you to everybody for attending today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.